But now I'm just going to give the floor to Non Una Di Meno, Italy. We have Enrica, Teresa, and Michela, and I'm very delighted to have them here. Of course, Non Una Di Meno is a feminist movement in Italy that started in Rome, but now has many different networks across the country. And they will talk to us about life after the pandemic and some similar recovery plans and the ideas that they have been developing and working on.
Thank you, Serena, and really thank you to all the presenters in this panel and this morning as well. So you introduced already Non Una Di Meno. I just want to say that we will try to give in this presentation the collective reflection that we made during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And I will start by giving a couple of elements of analysis and context in which the pandemic emergency has hit Italy. And Teresa and Michela will speak about grassroots experiences and the recovery plan, the analysis of the recovery plan. So about the context, it's important to say that at the outbreak of the pandemic, a new government coalition led by the Five Star Party had just replaced one of the most xenophobic governments of recent years, deeply influenced by the figure of the Minister of Interior, Matteo Salvini, which I guess you have been heard about. So while Salvini had been at the center of attention for his anti-immigrant policies, there was also another aspect, the alliance between the populistic Five Star Party and the far-right League, which is the party of Salvini. I tried to impose a family reform based on a combination between patriarchy and neoliberalism. And this reform was successfully opposed by the feminist movement and was also for us an important moment for the trans-feminist identity of the movement. So, I mean, a movement that also includes the demands of LGBT groups and trans-feminist issues, and but also give an idea of the general environment in which the feminist movement was developing during the year. On the other side, on the side of grassroots reactions, the legacy of 4 years of feminist movement, Non Una Di Meno, had imposed a politicization of the issue of violence against women, as we heard already from Lucy, Veronica, and many other interventions, bringing into the issue also exploitation, precarity of work, and providing a structural understanding of violence, as well as a new politicization of care as a site, as a central site of contestation and conflict. So this was already our legacy at that point. As is well known, in Italy, the most striking region during the pandemic was Lombardy. And this is important because the health system of Lombardy in specific had undergone deep neoliberal reforms during preceding years that had substantially eliminated community-based health services and transformed health into a privatized asset. So both during the first and the second wave, of the pandemic, the life of people was overshadowed by the priority of keeping the economy going. And of course, with the consequences that factories and workplaces were closed down too late to contrast the virus. The high number of deaths, Italy is the country that registers one of the highest incidence of death in Europe, vis-a-vis with active cases, was due to the old age of the Italian population, but also to a management of older and non-self-sufficient people that either rely on family structures, which means women support, of course, or on the confinement of vulnerable individuals. I want to give a couple of paradigmatic examples which we think are important because care homes for elderly in Italy are real site of confinement, detention houses are. And while the health system was collapsing, patients were transferred from hospitals to these care homes where the virus was freely spreading. And this was really the cause of also political death, because these were political decisions. At the same time, during the first weeks of the pandemic outbreak, 14 detainees died in prison revolts fueled by the impossibility of escaping the virus. Again, talking about confinements of vulnerabilities, Italy is also one of the few countries in Europe where migrants have not been released from administrative detention during the public health emergency, while detention and expulsion procedures continued as if the world has not changed. Plus further sites of confinement were invented. You have probably heard about the quarantine vessels where migrants have been blocked before disembarkment, but also where migrants already present in the territory were deported from reception facilities. So I stress all this because in our analysis, the pandemic detonated a series of contradictions in Italian society that had been at the center of the feminist analysis during previous year. On the one side, it unveiled a patriarchal and xenophobic society that romanticizes sexism by representing women care for kids, elders, and fragile subjects as a desire of conciliation between family and careers. This was a public discourse, a recurrent public discourse during the pandemic. And on the other side, the public discourse also hides systemic racism under the myth of a tolerant society. So, of course, for us, it was immediately clear the need to prioritize, but also to reconceive social reproduction as a central key to respond to the crisis. As in other countries, schools and children facilities were the first to be closed and the last to be reopened. Of course, this was a choice that showed once again that the burden of intergenerational reproduction depends on women, not only on mothers, it depends also on sisters, grandmothers, female relatives and friends, but on women, of course. and that the alleged conciliation between family and women jobs is not grounded in desire, but rather depends either on familistic welfare structures or on the externalization of care to migrant women workers. These migrant women workers that during the crisis have been left without assistance and without income. In turn, as we heard earlier, the earning divide between women and men and the expulsion of women from work during the pandemic crisis demonstrated the extent to which the condition of a large majority of women in Italy, both native and migrant, is cut across by class. It is a condition that relegates women to low-paid and precarious jobs, that expels women from decision-making processes, and by keeping women at home, expose them to violence. As in other countries, gender-based violence raised during the pandemic. So the last point I want to bring is that the closure of frontiers, which was the first institutional response to the crisis, brought to the forefront the connection between mobility and social reproduction. From the very first day of the emergency, it became clear that the food supply chain in Italy depends on migrant workers who are employed in agriculture, logistics, distribution, services, and services. Many of these workers refused to work due to the lack of safety conditions, while others were blocked by the restrictions of on movement between states. And also, you know, this issue of movements, mobility, the possibility of mobility, or the forced mobility that you also were raising regards, for example, riders in the supply chain, and a lot of workers. I just want to remember that today, while we were having this workshop, a migrant worker was killed in Italy during a strike while he was demonstrating in front of a food chain. And part of our analysis was also, it was very important for us to stress the centrality of freedom of movement as a central feminist struggle. This was during the pandemic, but this was also a legacy that came for us before of our analysis before the pandemic. Because when in 2016, the feminist movement was taking the center stage in the transnational politics, Italy was also at the center of the refugee crisis. And for us, the struggle in support of refugee women and asylum seekers was important because connected the feminist fight and the feminist experience against gender-based violence to the fight of migrant women across borders. And it was a foundational moment. So to sum up, our reflection during the pandemic concentrated on the necessity to radically rethink welfare institutions outside the family model. And Teresa will give some example. To rethink the connection between social reproduction, the health system, the environment, but also, as we said, exploitation and mobility, and to reconcile universal access to welfare around the struggle and the demand for freedom of movement. This is some of the point. I give the floor to Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you, Enrica. Yes, I will try to complement by just getting into after having this portrait of the context in which the pandemic hit Italy, a bit what we have been doing at the grassroots level, but also how we have been reflecting and strategizing politically on the current moment and on the possible questions we have opened for the way forward. So, as Enrica was saying, these are topics we were key to our reflection. What we have done, it's imagine immediately and engage into an exercise that has a double layer. One was to be really rooted on the ground of the emergencies happening, bearing into mind that we were not facing emergent problems. We were facing a structural and systemic power asymmetries and inequalities, and of course, extractive capitalism with its colonial connotation. And therefore, what we imagine is it was immediately through the real practice and the political exercise to imagine life beyond the pandemic. And we just imagine that to devastating impacts, we need powerful responses and unlimited ambition. So we immediately try to link our field also to the type of roots that have inspired our movement, as the pandemic has shown that social reproduction and life reproduction is incompatible with the neoliberal project of extending the logic of the markets to all aspects of our lives. And that's still true not only as a diagnosis, as Veronica was saying, but also in terms of how we want to push forward that proposals. Of course, within these, we have immediately understood the huge crisis of the social reproduction that this COVID pandemic has unveiled. And we are also very cognizant on how the responses at institutional policy level, not only at national level, but also in terms of global governance and architecture, are trying to grab it's trying to grab also our narratives and diagnoses and territories. And we are looking also how care and the social reproduction has been at the center of this crisis, and how there is a tension at the moment at institutional level to neutralize also the discourse around care and to grab the care from our political reading of it, trying to a process to make it technical and neutralize in the recovery plans that our government is about to implement. So in this sense, of course, the politicization, as Enrica was saying, of the reading of violence as systemic was really key. And we are also cognizant of the fact that the reconstruction of the capital and this new assembling of a global governance structure around the responses to the crisis will push also, as said by the Compass from Argentina, for a renewal of the sexual contract of labor, right? And including that a class dimension. Therefore, the pandemic hit Italy also on the eve of our global feminist and transfeminist strike of the 8th of March in 2020 in Italy, actually. And we could see immediately how through the weeks we could observe, as Enrica was saying, a huge increase of violence within households, and an increase of how also the role of staying at home was changing and the labor was entering, and how also that process of welfare grabbing from big financial corporations working on technology and digitalization were also entering through the schooling systems online and other platforms. 2020 has recorded the largest number of femicides in Italy since the 2000 in terms of percentage, and up today we are almost witnessing 50 femicides now a day. Therefore, the first policy responses given by the government were really silent on the issue of violence. on the issue of care and on the issue of the externalization of the welfare system that neoliberal policies have pushed throughout the years. And that's where we're very strong in keeping our voice high and in saying we might not need to write a new recovery feminist plan. We have a plan, which is our own national plan as Non Una Di Meno that we elaborated through a longer year in 2016 and 17 by thousands of hands and bodies. And just we need to consider that as a live document that can give the directionality to the transformation we're seeking for. And that's where also the grassroots responses at community level were fundamental to keep alive what it has been defined as essential work, but we know it's, of course, the social reproduction with all its implication. The autonomy and the economic autonomy, of course, of women and LGBTQI persons was immediately clear through the reading of violence that we were seeing. We saw how community-based responses were also not only able to take on their shoulders the gaps in the policy responses to the crisis in the immediate aspect of the reproduction of life, but they were really, and they are nowadays also bringing into perspective and highlighting the importance also of the aspect of the redistribution and of the commons, having the care and the feminist positioning at the heart of this response, which also opens a debate of how we overcome the dichotomy of public and private policies. We have been challenged a lot by the virtuality, of course, but we didn't surrender. And therefore, we try as much as possible to be present immediately on the spaces, even if they were forbidden, by ensuring that all the community-based service could keep running. This morning, Rachel was talking about the abortion, right? So also how in Italy, where we have this law since many years, we had to fight with many of us being in the street to ensure that the policies defending our safe right to safe and free abortion were implemented also during the pandemic, no? Where the health system was overcharged because of the privatization and liberalization policies that we have seen and faced in the last years. And therefore, within these territorial responses, we have connected with care workers. We have connected and be in synergy also with the great responses that also the sex workers were giving in terms of solidarity and mutualistic replies to the crisis, including the support to the asylum seeker and migrants. We have helped the health territorial spaces to keep working to ensure our right for sexual and reproductive health. We work together and in strong synergy, and that's also something that has been said today about how we not only have discovered and empower our intersectionality of the struggle, but also how that needs to be transversal somehow. And that's exactly what happened here in terms of the education system and the schools, where both teachers, students, and parents came together to really react also on how we were facing the education in that moment, and the linkages with the social reproduction, of course, work not only from a parenthood perspective, but also from a worker's perspective as the teachers. We have worked strongly also with the LGBTIQ persons and organizations to ensure also the response to gender-based violence in households, also for many teenagers. And therefore, many were the capacities we developed under this moment, which was also to keep alive the monitoring, for example, about the implementation of certain rights, but also the insurance, as Enrica was saying, that the food production, which is now we have heard the food sovereignty and how it is linked to our body, could work. And in fact, the shorter and localized value chains who work on agroecological terms towards food sovereignty principle were far more resilient and responsive to sustain networks for food far beyond the supermarket spaces. We also launched a campaign in terms of social media because we didn't want to surrender to the isolation of our bodies and emotion, but we wanted really to try to stay together as much as possible in also within the complexity, not lose the imaginary of our desires, overcoming these, and therefore really trying to look for proposals and how also, as Lucy was saying, take a use of a different way to be present and capture the public debate, the public discourse, and the public spaces through a lot of lettering on the walls, social media campaigns about "I'm staying home, but what about all my rights? What about the policy demands that are urgent in this moment? And what about the fracture, the systemic fracture of this moment?" We therefore went into that, and the precarization of our lives and horizon became even more clear, of course, after years of neoliberal policies and the debt. Of course, we could see that in December 2020, out of 110,000 jobs lost in Italy, 99,000 were women. And therefore, it's pretty clear how also the labor conditions were mixed in this space between intimacy of home, extended endless hours of exploitation, precarity, and failure of welfare and protection and social protection systems to uplift and redistribute the care work. In that sense, we have not surrendered to be isolated among ourselves, but we did not surrender to be isolated or unable to continue to foster the strong solidarity and articulation that has connotated so strongly our own being as Non Una Di Meno, which is the connection with all the other feminist and transfeminist movement worldwide at global level that have made and have politicized the reading of violence and use the process of the strike. Also interrogating ourselves, how do we arrive to our next strike with this reproduction and social reproduction struggle? In that sense, from one side, we have strengthened a lot the intersectionality of the struggles also of other movements in Italy, particularly the Italian chapter of Black Lives Matter and all the second generation youth which are fighting for the right of citizenship against this racial and systemic racism and discrimination, together also with some Friday for Future and the youth also struggling against the corporate capture and extractivist capitalism, which is harming our ecosystem, ecologies, lands and territories and bodies. And therefore we have intervene these networks with the schools, with the health providers and the workers who not only in the informal sector, but also who suffer from high level of precarity from culture to big corporations. And therefore we have from one side empowered that aspect and felt also strongly driven by the powerful call that also came from the Chilean sisters, now that immediately put on a facade of a building, we will not come back to normality, because normality was the problem. And that was really clear. And we gathered together into this space that it's called Feministas Transfronterizas, which is transnational feminist. So a transnational space of articulation where we can gather and celebrate the plurality of political feminisms and readings by also identify common ground of struggles and shared experience. And that was really intense throughout the pandemic period. We have also, I will share the links in the chat in a minute. We have also drafted together with several organizations from all around the world a manifesto to come out from the pandemic all together, because we realized by talking and sharing our experiences that the reading and the diagnosis Veronica was referring to was quite common. And therefore, we have been then further inspired to strengthen this space by also the resistance struggles that were unable to break the pandemic and still bring bodies on the street to defend essential rights, as the one in Poland against their attacks on abortion, like in Argentina for the law on the abortion in December, the Indian sisters struggling for weeks now for the implementation at their country level of corporate capture laws that will grab further their own agriculture and food sovereignty, the mobilizations in Nigeria against institutional criminalization and forces. Therefore, we've been working on this very strongly, and we continue to do that. Now, a couple of words just to conclude and give the floor to Michela to enter into the recovery. Of course, a lot of the global governance reassessment and setting stage to relaunch the same system is in track, and it's landing at national level through several policies. We believed, we analyzed that the issue of governance is quite key. Of course, it's not merely about austerity now, it's about this fake redistribution and this strong tendency to talk about transformation. But what we want is not only a radical transformation, we want and have always claimed a clear positioning and directionality of this transformation. So we don't want any transformation, we want a transformation which has a clear positioning and a clear directionality. We are looking at the corporate capture of our own narrative now, of our own livelihood. There's a lot of greenwashing and pinkwashing. We hear a lot institutions talking about this restarting plan and gender mainstream, but we don't want to be mainstream. We want autonomy. We want autonomy from violence. And I think that's also one of the tricky concepts. And there's a clash of narratives at the moment by which we need to resist to really reclaim the politicization of that narrative and that semantic space. So all that ecological transition that in Italy is now on top level is actually going to bring funds to the same corporations that have been extracting our territories, the big work on digitalization that it's also really transversal to many of the global governance and national restarting has also a lot of critical points that we should also have movements continue to keep addressing, as they are the entry point also of this new wave of philanthropic capitalism into all the data and digitalization aspect, and of course make visible the power asymmetries lying within. Finally, just to say that the other part that we see in the recovery plans is about sustainability, and we believe this is the new paradigm that it's hiding the final dismantle of the rights foundation of our global architecture. So we have been working a lot on what new infrastructures of care do we want, how do we take our plan, and how we keep open the conflict spaces opened by these crises, how can we be practical in demanding some of the claims that we have been reflecting on. And of course, we are going to do that also by ensuring and keeping high our presence and visibility in the public debate and in the public spaces, being in the streets and reclaiming as well the new territories we want to reconfigure after this pandemic. And therefore, I think also, well, Michela will say this better, but how it is important also to ensure this mobilization flow for us is quite critical, and we are going to have a huge mobilization on July, marking the fact that the Turkey authoritarian and fascist government is going to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. So I'm going to stop here and give the floor to Michela.
Thank you very much for your interventions, and thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to be very, very brief because my comrades already said a lot of what we have been elaborating in this over the last months. So basically, what I want to open my intervention with is a question about the transnational feminist strike, the strike that we've been involved into and we've been building in our territory for the last 4 years. So when we talk about recovery, what we noticed as a feminist movement in Italy is that this recovery will not bring us to will not bring us to a new horizon that complies with our expectations as feminists, that complies with our demands, but it will bring us to a reorganization of capital that is a completely different scenario with respect to what we had in the previous phase with respect to the pandemic. So as Italy and Europe, we were already going through a crisis, a strong stagnation, and this recovery will not even bring us back to the level of productivity and the economic conditions that we were experiencing before. So this recovery will only be a reorganization of capital and neoliberal relationships. So in this scenario, as Non Una Di Meno, we wonder how do we use our main instrument, political instrument that has been the transnational feminist strike as a tool to strike against a reorganization that will not question the sexual and racial division of labor that underpins discrimination and violence against women and non-binary subjectivities. So what alliances at a national and transnational level are necessary for us to rethink the strike that we've been using in the last years and make it an effective tool to question this new neoliberal scenario that will be configured by the whole global recovery process. A few words on what we did with respect to the recovery plan in Europe. As Non Una Di Meno in January, we organized thematic assemblies on different aspects of the recovery plan in order to produce some collective elaboration on and critical, obviously, from a feminist perspective on the recovery plan. And this resulted in 6 different documents on health, labor and economy, the treatment of violence, of gender violence, the ecological transition, and that's it. What we first notice is that both at a national and at an international European level, the recovery process has been a profoundly top-down process. So it was characterized by an anti-democratic methodology that did not involve at both level social actors, obviously feminist organizations, unions, and workers. So the idea of the emergency and the discourse about emergency allowed the centralization of power that will reflect the centralization of capital that the recovery process will allow in the next years. So at an international level, as you know, the European Union will be allocating 750 billions of euros to the whole union. Part of these funds will be in the form of debt, and the other part will be in the form of lost funds. To a country like Italy, for example, will be allocated around 200 billion euros, with a percentage and a share of debt with respect to the lost fund that is way higher than what will be allocated in other countries. So this is already something that tells us a lot about the effects that this old recovery process will have on debt in Italy, on public debt, and especially in peripheral countries in Europe that have already that already have to sustain a very strong burden in terms of public debt. So our debt is expected to increase in the next years. But on the other hand, what we thought could have been a definitive suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact in the European Union, which is a legal framework that disciplines fiscal policies in Europe, and that was suspended during the crisis. So what we think would have been a definitive suspension has revealed to be a temporary suspension. As a matter of fact, this week, the economic commissioner of the European Union announced that the suspension of the Stability and Growth Pact in Europe will only last until 2023. And in 2023, the suspension will be lifted, which means that the austerity architecture in Europe will come back, in a sense, will be reimposed, causing basically the same condition and the same mechanisms of power internal to the European Union and interclass and intergender that we have already experienced as a response to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So actually the scenario will not change, no new solution will be implemented. We can only foresee a similar strategy with respect to 2007 and 2008 crisis, which will imply a major pressure of capital on working conditions all over Europe, and in particular on Italy, in particular in Italy, with the consequences that we already know and we already mentioned on social reproduction, that will be more intensively affected, and there is a ground for a more intense extraction, as we already said. So I will try to be very brief because we already occupied a lot of space. At a national level, the recovery plan, as Teresa already mentioned, is based on 3 pillars, which are basically the digitalization, the ecological transition, and the social inclusion. So basically the first 2 pillars are 2 pillars that will shape the public policies in Italy, but that have been configured and have been thought in the recovery plan as ways to ease the entrance of foreign capital in Italy for investments that will pass through the market mechanisms and that will not question. So this recovery plan will not question market mechanisms, but on the other hand, it relies profoundly on market mechanisms for its implementation. And as we know, market mechanisms do not favor women when structural imbalances already exist in the society. The third mechanism, the third pillar of the recovery plan is a social inclusion of women, social inclusion of young people and of people from the South. I want to focus in particular on the social inclusion of women, first of all, because the definition of women automatically excludes in the policy framework other subjects that are non-binary, that are that do not represent the white worker ideal of women that the policies are addressed to. On the other hand, this category, social inclusion of women, I believe that it produces a very strong denial of what women already do for society, obviously. Saying that women have to be included automatically and ideologically denies the role and the charge of the domestic and reproductive labor that they already do on a daily basis for our societies. And so at the same time, this category excludes and invisibilizes reproductive labor, while not questioning the conditions in the labor market at which women should be included in theory. So this is a very conservative category, that of inclusion, because at the same time those who question the distinction between reproductive and productive labor, and does not affect labor demand, which is something that characterizes the old recovery plan in Italy. So no labor demand, the conditions of labor, namely labor demand, is not questioned in any of its aspects, while we know that precarious work, informal work, migrant labor, sexual work in Italy have been sustaining the economy and have been the ground for very intense exploitation during the crisis. So this plan does not address any of these problems relating to labor demand. I will try to be very brief in describing our measures and our proposals that keep being the same in the fight for economic autodetermination in Italy. What we've been talking a lot about and we've been demanding is a European minimum salary common to all European territories that will avoid working imbalances between workers. We claim for an unconditional permit of stay for all migrants at a European level. And third, we claim for income of, we call it income of autodetermination, that we think as a measure to prevent and to fight violence against women, and that also addresses all the what you call the plurality of economies that already exist in our territories and that are not covered by formal labor, but still need to be supported economically. So this is basically what we claim. Together with obviously what Teresa already mentioned, so a claim for universal income that is not linked to any to labor or to any other sort of social inclusion, and especially to the private market inclusion. To go to a conclusion, I want to invite you to continue this conversation on an assembly that we are organizing on the 20th of July, and that will involve feminist organizations from all over the world. It is an assembly organized by the network Feministas Transfronterizas that Teresa already talked about, and the assembly will be held on the 20th at 5 p.m. I will share with you the invitation, and will be based on a collective reflection on the political analysis of the current political phase we are going through, and on feminist perspectives and possibilities of feminist transnational organizations for the future. So I thank you very much for this invitation, and I hope we will be able to continue our alliance and dialogue.